Should Washington, D.C. become a state? Tomorrow, the House is voting on a statehood bill for the first time since 1993. President Trump reignited this debate when he sent the National Guard to control police brutality protests in D.C. Now, D.C. is the only jurisdiction where the president has authority over the National Guard instead of the governor. MSNBC anchor Andrea Mitchell reports.
It's the city where federal forces cleared protesters across from the White House with chemical gas so the president could cross the park to a photo op. While a military helicopter swooped down over city streets to chase urban demonstrators, a combat zone maneuver more suitable for Fallujah than downtown D.C.
Thank you.
The city's mayor could not stop any of that, or troops being stationed at sacred monuments, because unlike 50 states and the U.S. territories, Washington is the only jurisdiction where the National Guard answers to the president instead of to a governor.
To have two senators that vote for us and speak for us, and a voting representative in Congress. But we also needed to make sure that our borders aren't breached by the federal government.
The capital city has 702,000 residents, more than Vermont or Wyoming, and people here pay more total federal taxes than 22 states. What the district does not have is a vote in Congress, not since a law passed in 1801, when Thomas Jefferson was president. You've been in Congress for 17 terms. What does it feel like to never be able to vote on final passage for one of your bills?
It feels like my city is not fully respected, despite paying the highest federal income taxes per capita in the United States.
ELEANOR Holmes Norton was born in D.C. 83 years ago, the great-granddaughter of Richard Holmes, who escaped from a Virginia slave master to find work in the nation's capital.
Richard Holmes made it to freedom, but he did not make it to equality, nor have those in his lineage yet made it to equality. That's why we need statehood, at least personally. Well, I need statehood.
So help me God.
With no senator, D.C. residents have no say on confirming Supreme Court justices or cabinet members or other officials. Congress hasn't even debated statehood since 1993, when it lost.
This deprivation of statehood is unjust.
Despite strong support now in the House, most Senate Republicans are still opposed.
I don't think you're going to have many in the Republican conference for that.
I think our founding fathers were correct in the first place.
Still, Friday's debate will give Washington a chance to protest against taxation without representation, a principle that was supposed to be settled by those founders more than 200 years ago.
MSNBC anchor Andrea Mitchell joins us now. Andrea, thank you so much for being with us here on News Now. We're thrilled to have you. The White House does not want to make D.C. a state. Why? And will that likely have an impact on the vote?
Well, indeed, the vote is going to be overwhelming in the House. They already have more House members sponsoring it than they need to pass it. But Mitch McConnell will not bring it up in the Senate. The president has said he will veto it, and it's politics. Right now, it's Republican politics because it would dilute the Republican Senate because D.C. is predominantly Democratic. There's no question about that. Votes Democratic. It would mean if they do become a state, there would be 2 more Democratic senators, most likely, or someone independent at least, caucusing with the Democrats. It used to be, ironically, the Southern Democrats who opposed it because at that time, D.C. was really predominantly African-American black, and now it is about 50-50, still majority black, but much closer now, much more evenly divided. Still, it's all politics. It comes down to that. Still, this is important symbolically.
How do the constituents in D.C. feel? Is there significant support for statehood among residents there?
There sure is. And our license plates say taxation without representation. There are so many issues that we can't vote on, that we don't have anyone representing us. ELEANOR Holmes Norton is just iconic here. She's been the delegate for such a long time. She marched with Dr. King. She's very, very, very popular, but she cannot vote, and that makes a big difference. So, yeah, there's a lot of support for it, but even though it's clearly not going to get to the Senate, it's not going to ever be approved by President Trump, the hope now is that with a big vote, it'll at least give it a lot more weight, let's say, and if Joe Biden is elected And if the Senate were to turn, then there would be a real chance for it. It would be such a major change.
Yeah, is that what proponents are saying about the significance of this vote tomorrow, that maybe it will just shine a light on it once again, and hopefully, if not tomorrow, this will be something that may come up again soon?
Yeah, and I think it really got a lot of heft, a lot of focus, because on that day 3 weeks ago when the president was marching through Lafayette Square and the square was cleared, it was a peaceful protest by all accounts of our correspondents on the ground. But there was chemical gas used, even though there was an initial denial. They finally acknowledged that. And that military show of force, the National Guard arrayed in front of the Lincoln Memorial, that really shocked a lot of people to discover that the mayor had no control over the National Guard because D.C. is not a state and she's not a governor. And the president's threat to use the 82nd Airborne, they were arrayed and mobilized around the city, not activated, not deployed, because he then backed down. But he could have had the 82nd Airborne in here, and there was a lot of resentment of that.
Andrea Mitchell, it is such an honor to have you on News Now. I hope you'll come back and visit us again soon.
It's great to be with you, Allison. Anytime. Just ask.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.